Welcome everybody to Ring of Fire Con and the panel on mythology and storytelling. We are here with our esteemed guests here today, and I am going to have each of them introduce themselves and tell them what they write. And we will start with Miss Megan Mackie.
Hi, I'm Megan Mackie. I write urban fantasy cyberpunk, and these are my books, the Lucky Devil series.
Excellent. And then Mr. Marion Harmon.
Marion G. Harmon, the author of the Wearing the Cape series of superhero novels. Book 8 just came out this last year, working on book 9 and role-playing game supplements for it.
Excellent. And Mr. DJ Butler.
So, yeah, I write a variety of things, including epic fantasy, mythologically influenced, I guess, Witchy Eye and sequels, the Witchy War series from Bane, but I've got a number of other things out as well.
Excellent. And Mr. J.D. Jordan.
Hello, yeah, my name's J.D. Jordan. I'm a UX designer by day, and I write sci-fi and historical science fiction outside of that. On shelves, I've got a book called Calamity, which is Calamity Jane and a alien gunslinger set in a sort of a sci-fi spun Wild West. And I've got a piece in issue 82 of the Gazette, the Granville Gazette and the Universe Annex, about Hopi Native Americans with superpowers. And so I try to mix sci-fi into, well, whatever I can get my hands on.
Yeah.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Rick Hines.
Hello. So I write sarcastic urban fantasy about the end of the world called the Seventh Age series. My first book, Seventh Age Dawn, is out. Sequel's coming out later. And then I also write RPGs like the Red Opera, 5th edition campaign settings, and freelance for a bunch of other game companies.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay. So we have a rich diversity here because we have superheroes, we have urban fantasy, we have science fiction, we have epic fantasy, and flintlock fantasy, and then we also have cyberpunk urban fantasy, which is a pretty diverse panel. So, mythology is always amazing when it comes in from, real life sources. So I will start by asking you, what mythologies have influenced each of you in your writing?
Who do you want to go first?
We'll start with you, Rick. You spoke up first.
All right. The Freemasons. Hands down, as an electrician in Chicago, when I was demolishing buildings in the Chicago Board of Trade and I was taking panels off the wall, I had found this crazy symbol that I actually got tattooed right here later on. It was the official Alchemy Guild symbol from 1863, and it was put in there by the Freemasons. And they had on there this slogan that said, "A man's only worth is how much wealth he could generate," which is creepy considering the context of the Chicago Board of Trade, what was there. And
that's interesting.
They put that there. And I looked up what the symbol really meant, and I got really big into exploring Masonry, the Golden Dawn, Jack Parsons and the JPL and all of these secret societies and even pseudo secret societies and spiritualism in the turn of the century. And the symbol actually meant finding wealth within the center of your soul. And they had kind of warped that. And I was like, oh, this is great. I'm totally going to write urban fantasy based off of this whole idea. That's actually why I started writing in the first place. Was I found this by day, and my boss, who was a foreman, was he was a total hippie. He was like, man, this place is a cathedral to money. He was like, because we kept finding more and more stuff hidden behind panels and in the walls and baked into the concrete. And when you get into, there's such fascination and such love about mysticism, Gnosticism, and a lot of other, sort of sacred geometry practices in building and construction. And so for me, I play a lot with those themes in urban fantasy because I find that there's a very strong mesh.
Interesting. Okay, J.D. Jordan.
I suppose in my own work, I try to draw from unconventional sources. So in addition to being a designer, I was saying before we started recording that I have a degree in history. And so depending on where you look at in history for sources, you're going to tread on mythology, right? So I think, you know, being, you know, educated as a historian or whatever, a lot of places you look back are like the classics and stuff like that, and you find those Greek and Roman influences everywhere. But I think folks are used to that, and so I often try to look for things that they're not used to. So a family trip, for instance, that I have 5 kids, and I threw them all in an RV and drove from Atlanta to the Grand Canyon, and on the way we passed through the Hopi Reservation and some of the Pueblo villages and stuff that are built up in the rocks on like the Ute Reservation. And so looking at that stuff really exposed me to a mythology outside of what I was used to, and that I decided, you know, I took a spin with that through a short story that's in the Gazette called Shift, which is takes this sort of many worlds, the destruction and recreation of the world cycle that the Hopi mythology speaks of, and kind of casts it in a sci-fi voice, and used the sensitivity reader to make sure I didn't totally screw up, you know, what the Hopi experience is like. So anytime I think you can find a bit of mythology that a largely Western-oriented audience, which we're writing for in the United States, I think, is a piece of mythology that maybe they're not super familiar with, I think that's pretty exciting because you can tread new territory with it.
All right, Mr. Butler.
So, you know, a watershed moment for me was in high school discovering the Ethiopic Apocalypse of Enoch, which was one of the, if you read critical biblical scholars, it's sort of the outstanding candidate for a book that should have made it into the Bible and very nearly did, and was in some very late lists, a canon list, but did not make the final one for Western churches. It actually is in some Eastern, some Orthodox Bibles, and it was a revelation because the book of Enoch, there are other books of Enoch. This is First Enoch, is deeply mythological, and it's connected with the Bible, but the authors clearly understand things differently from the way the final editors of the Bible do. It starts with the story of the fallen angels, and there are 2 different stories that have been stitched together. So the fallen angels are sometimes led by Azazel and sometimes by Semyaz, depending on which chapter you're reading. But they've been cast down to earth, and they come to Enoch, asking Enoch to go intercede with God on their behalf. And it's a myth that that may or may not be connected with the Day of Atonement. And so that really kind of opened up my eyes to seeing in our Western and Judeo-Christian tradition a swarm of competing and rival and different mythologies, which I think has been a fascinating place for me to play in to this day.
Awesome. And Mr. Harmon.
Well, coincidentally, it's another aspect of Christian mythology for me as well. Although in my case, it was exposure to what I would call the early and late Middle Ages Judeo-Christian mythologies. And by that, I mean, for example, outside of the core stories, which of course are preserved kind of in amber in the canonical scriptures, then you've got things like the Wandering Jew, the 30 pieces of silver, the spear of you know, the sacred spear, all of Longinus, and all of these other myths that had developed and got very systematized. And additional, I mean, angelology is a huge thing that ties into Hermetic magic and all this other stuff. To me, that it was a revelation to me to discover what I call living mythologies, because they're mythologies that are outside of but connected to our current cultural base. So they're not like reading fairy tales of Greek mythology and Norse mythology and stuff that has no real effect on us except for tangentially, like the days of the week. This is stuff that's very much with us, and it just was fascinating to me. So there you go.
I think there's a real interesting point there, which is that, you know, when we read the writings of someone like Sophocles or Aeschylus, they're working with their own living tradition, and the stories have liturgical meaning for them, and they think that they are in some sense true, right? But from the Renaissance on, where we pick up and we use somebody else's mythology, we are consciously working with something we think is not true. Right?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, some of these things have been conflated into essentially ideas of folk magic, esotericism, occultism, mysticism, and so Gnosticism, and so on. But before we get into that, we can't forget our last person on the panel here.
She's not the last one. She's just the one who hasn't spoken yet on this question.
So my entry into mythology, well, when I was in, I think it was grade school going into junior high, around that time, I discovered that my library had these really old books called the World Mythology books, and there was like 6 to 8 of them there. I found out later there were actually quite a few more, but I would take them one at a time and I would read them like they were novels, and I'd like read all the different myths, and it wasn't just the classic Greek, Roman, and Egyptian. There was also, like, had the Vikings, they had the Celts, they had Northern America, Southern America. So I was getting like this big exposure at the right age to all of this, different ways of perceiving creation stories, perceiving why the rules are the way they are, like why women are women and men are men, and then in like the Native American ones that have the alternate genders and things like that. So
Absolutely.
all of those ideas that end up having become mainstream since I've become an adult, I got exposed to as a very young child. And I've since collected all of those back. Now, granted, these mythologies are like from the 1970s, so like we have advanced even further in our study of them, and like the nuances and the stories, like what we know are more accurate than, especially for like the Aztecian one, when I read it again as an adult, and I was like, we don't think that anymore based off of this study. But interesting that was that interpretation at that time, and the stories were still very, very valid. So like, since becoming an author and going back to them as an adult, I'm going to them to mine out the bits of the stories that were universal, that were like, this is an interesting take on this idea that you don't see very often. And like, in my world here, which is set in an alternate Chicago where magic has always existed. It's out in the open. Everybody knows about it. There's magical like creatures everywhere. Like, I've got like a mermaid who's a dog groomer. I've got a fairy who's a bartender. I've got a centaur who's an actuary. They've just always been, this is the old hat, but now technology is trying to emulate and copy what magic can do, and it's starting to replace magic. So the cyber tech and the super tech is all pushing magic stuff out. But when I was looking and building my population, I was like, I want to have something, not just the classical centaur, mermaid, that we all know. So like, I also have things, a group of people called the Coatls, who are like off of the Aztecian Quetzalcoatl god. So they're serpent people with feathers as their hair and everything, but that's what they are. They're from South America. And I have another one where I call them the Shiva, where they have 4 arms, and they're from Asia.
So, I mean, there's a lot of different mythologies that have been, mentioned. We have Hopi, we have, Freemason, Freemason mysticism and esotericism. We were talking about, Egyptian. We're talking about all of these different aspects. How do you fold that into your writing? How does it, how is it reflected in your writing? Because each of you had said at one point, this is stuff that has influenced me. So in terms of your writing, what areas do you incorporate, and how true do you stay to them? And we'll start with Mr. Jordan.
I knew you were going to pick me. I'm sitting here trying to formulate my answer. So I think I think one of the interesting things I think about when considering the mythological component is whether or not it's going to be literal, that is, it's going to be real in the world of the story, or if it's going to be metaphorical. And that's why I think it's kind of interesting. I think David may brought it up a minute ago, that there is a distinction somehow in our minds, both us as people and us as writers, of the mythologies that we consider real and the ones that we consider myth, right? So the ancient Greek, the ancient Roman, Egyptian, or in the case of the Shift, the Hopi story, as an outsider looking at the Hopi mythology, like, clearly it's a mythological system. It's not a real these are not real things in the universe from my POV as the author. Though you arguably can, David was making the point about like maybe Catharism or Eastern Christianity. We might see those as myth even if we're devout Christians, right? So it's always tricky, I think, when you start talking about like Christianity as a myth. For full disclosure, like as an atheist, I don't have a problem with that. But when I talk about that with other people, they might be like, no, that's
Yeah, exactly.
not. Right. So in the context of whether or not it's real or not for the character. And so I think as a storyteller, I often try to walk that line and frame it in a way that the reader can choose to believe in it or not. And it still has a metaphorical context. So I try to use it for a symbolism purpose more often than not, because like myth versus religion in real life, it may vary from person to person. But if you're doing a magic system or something, Stargate-y, where aliens are representative of
We're getting to that.
system, right? Then you also get to embrace, this is true. It might just be true in a way other than you expected, and that's what I always like to try to get out of it. If you go back to like, the story of the Trojan War, for instance, a lot of the stuff did happen, but the stories we get are not true. And so it's, where do we find the real in the myth? And that's always the part that's, I think, cool to try to tell.
Excellent. Mr. Hines.
So I definitely take a lot of like creepypasta and sort of internet group mythology in
That's a good idea. That's an interesting idea.
A way to make our stuff modern, right? Because when you look at all the things that I tend to write, I do a lot of cryptids and weird monsters and demons and various devils and a lot of Gnosticism in my things. But those are my magic systems, like he was just talking about below. I look, I've read countless books on Hermetic theory and principles, and I use those as a foundation for how magic works as a baseline for almost like a rule set of that.
Interesting.
But through this, I get to have my main characters and the characters of the story kind of react to some of this in a completely sarcastic, what? You got to be kidding me. There's no way that happened. And like, when they're presented with that cross reality. So
Exactly.
for me, the myths and the magic that are out there are sort of, they are the rules that the world is secretly running behind. And then when real people get to interact with them, they will approach it with a sarcastic bent of disbelief. And then how can we take this and then modernize it to our current day? So it is complete, like, from the character's perspective, it is complete bastardization. Wait, you're telling me if I eat this demon's heart, I have the power to telekinetically, control people's minds? Cool. I'm going to use this so I don't have to pay rent, and get out of it from, my landlords. Completely downplaying, the aspect of this wondrous thing and grinding it through the wheels of corporation. So I will take much more of an internet myth grind towards the philosophy of like, what would happen if our current culture group thought, these
myths. Mr. Butler.
So I think there's nothing wrong with borrowing from other people's mythologies. I think that we advance as a species by sharing, and that's a kind of sharing. And I certainly have done that. I've got a children's book a children's trilogy with Random House called The Extraordinary Journeys of Clockwork Charlie, which is set in a fantasy Victorian London and then ultimately other places in the world. And I borrow characters from Islamic folklore and also from from Hindu mythology, as well as from Northern European folk tales for that. But I actually, I am a believer, and the Bible is one of my sacred texts. And so for me, I absolutely experience that people get offended or wonder if they should be offended when they read things I've written. But it's not that I am an outsider saying, let me get in here and explore your Bible myths. I want to be like Aeschylus and Sophocles. I want to explore my own living mythology, not as a series of false tales, but as a set of stories that give my own traditions meaning.
Meaning and weight. Interesting.
Meaning and weight, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is typically so usually most of what I write works with Bible mythology in one way or another.
Interesting. Miss Mackie.
I mean, yeah, for me, it's become a very loaded question because of the question of appropriation and a question of misrepresenting for another agenda, another culture's stories. And so I've had to think about it quite a bit lately. Like I had a character that I was borrowing from Chinese mythology that someone called me out on, and they're like, you're turning this into a monster, and this is part of this mythology, and you're not Chinese, so what right do you have to do that? And I personally believe that all the stories belong to all of humanity, so to get upset about one person taking something and doing something else with it is sort of silly. But I can also see the other side in that, like, sometimes we took, like, way back in the times of filmmaking and stuff, where there was like the savage looked like this, and they took this symbol of like a Native American tribe and turned them into villains and then reinterpreted it into something that it wasn't.
Mm.
And so the balance of showing it what it was, what the stories are, what the what am I trying to say, the original,
The subject matter.
yeah, the subject matter, and they would interpret their story in their own personal context, and we're trying to reinterpret it into our context. And I mean, that's true of anything that an author writes, because we don't know everything. Like, we don't actually, most of us don't actually know how to disarm a bomb, but we're going to put bombs because they're exciting in our books anyway.
Yes.
So we have to kind of get a vague idea of how it works to.
That's why our Google search histories are crazy.
Yes.
Well, yes. I mean, let's just be honest. All of us are on some NSA watch list somewhere. Mr. Harmon, and then I want to actually go back to something that Megan said. So, Mr. Harmon.
Well, one of the things that I've been trying to keep in mind of my series is that since I'm writing a modern, 21st century story, all of us live in a mythological world, which is to say we all have our myths, and they're very different. We have atheists, we have agnostics, we have, Orthodox Christians, Orthodox, Jews. We all travel through our life surrounded by our own myths, and we're interacting constantly with people with different myths. And so one of the things that I tried to kind of not so much, pound, but use as keep in mind for the background of my world, which just to give you a thumbnail, was basically our own mundane world, so to speak, until about 15 years ago when an event happened, which I never explained. Just people then started manifesting powers under stress, a certain percentage of people. And these powers would be shaped by the nature of the stress at the time, their own personalities, and their beliefs. So you had a lot of people that were manifesting, classic Western superhero tropes, the capes, in other words. But there were also a lot of people who were manifesting stuff right out of their own mythologies, their own beliefs, their own spiritualism. And nobody knows what happened to start this, and nobody knows what is real so much. It's a very interesting world to be an atheist or an agnostic in, because you have saints and you have people who think they are angels or possibly the avatars of gods. And I like that I intentionally have never explained it. I've thrown out people's thoughts and philosophies that they've developed around it, but it's never going to be explained because our world isn't. And that's one of our aspects as human beings, is we don't know. And
yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So, well, that's really what I'm just winding up to, is that so I managed to have my cake and eat it too. I have gods, I have angels, I have demons, I have devils, I have heroes, I have monsters. But the ultimate explanations for reality are opaque. We don't know for sure, and they never will.
Now, one of the things that, going back to what Megan said, God's being reinterpreted. One of my kids' favorite movies is Hercules, and they have Hercules
Talking about reinterpreted, yes,
with Hades as essentially, hey, I'm the devil.
Yeah.
Which I kind of sit there and as I am, usually on the couch as they're watching this, reading my book, and I go like, that's not Hades. Hades is not that. Hades is not the devil. But then I have to remind myself that a lot of what we look at, just like Megan said, we take through our own cultural lens and we do reinterpret mythology. So, you know, I mean, Hades was pretty much not a bad guy. Actually, of all the Greek gods, he was probably the most like straight and narrow because he didn't like, you know, do horrible things to people usually. He was just kind of starting when, hey, dude, these are the rules. Sorry. I mean, in classical D&D terms, he's lawful neutral. You know, these are the rules. I follow the rules. It kind of sucks, I know, but that's where we're at. Okay? You know,
the line once to go abduct his wife, and then that was it.
Which also even that mythology is actually a question, but we'll get to that in a second.
Faithful, unlike Zeus.
Yeah, because that mythology in and of itself, when he kidnapped his wife, supposedly there was a question of Persephone wanting to do it, and Demeter, is it Persephone Demeter, or am I wrong in that?
No,
You
Persephone
got it, yeah.
is the daughter,
Okay.
Demeter is the mother.
Demeter essentially having a really massive issue of, no, my wife doesn't date, or my daughter doesn't date anyone ever.
She's gonna go be a
You know, so essentially she's essentially the Greek equivalent. She's the Greek equivalent of an angry mother-in-law.
Well, bridal kidnapping is a very old ritual practice where everybody is in on it, and you have a kidnapping to sort of explain why the bride is changing one family. My great grandfather kidnapped his bride. Everybody knew it was happening. It was planned. It's how you do it.
With it.
So yeah, the story you tell is it was a kidnapping, but you know what's going on is the marriage and relocation.
Yeah.
It's a marriage and relocation. Interesting.
I mean, let's be real here.
Also-
This same mythology, Zeus turned into a swan and had extra kids in crazy forms of bestiality. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I mean, you know,
Yeah, I like the
The
bull.
woman who was like,
Zeus was, I mean, you know,
Don't forget the shower of gold.
yeah, Zeus was a kinky, dirty boy, you know, in many ways. But let's, you know,
well, another point I'd actually like to make too is like sometimes the common interpretation of a myth is not always the same interpretation that they even had at the time. Because I like to go back to the myth of Medusa, where the common broad story is that she like had an affair in the temple and got made ugly as punishment. But they're uncovering evidence now that the myth of Medusa had a different meaning for women, in that she was raped in the temple and the goddess granted her the power to prevent a man from ever doing that to her again. And they have found Medusa heads on these old ancient buildings that they found a few other things, and they think this was a battered women's shelter. So the Medusa was the symbol of protection for women against husbands.
And myths vary, right? We more than we understand. We believe that the Greek mythology, for example, had esoteric meaning for people who were initiated. So something like the hymn to Demeter that talks about the kidnapping of Persephone describes actions that appear to be ritual and we think were acted out at Eleusis or other places, and we don't know what it meant to the people who were doing it.
It is true that these older mythologies, we tend to, what we get is the comic strip version.
Yeah.
Completely stripped of all of the philosophy around
the
it.
nuance.
Especially if we're getting it from the Dolaires, which is what I read as a kid, or Rick Riordan or Neil Gaiman.
Oh yes.
It's been digested. Yeah.
Very
Yeah, because it's only the public stories that weren't the initiated mysteries and stuff that got written down and survived. And then what I'm hearing you guys talk about is really interesting in the sense that most of the myths are seen through someone's cultural lens, right? Like if you go back to the ancient world, like the Romans tried to one-to-one match all the Egyptian gods to their gods because it was the way they could make it make sense and still fold the Egyptians into the empire. And of course we see that now, like modern day, Christian culture is looking at other mythologies and trying to do the one-to-one match, and it just doesn't always there. Just like other constructs like gender and stuff don't always line up culture to culture. But it's really interesting as Westerners, if we go to another culture and watch them look at us, it's weird. Right? I remember as a kid watching, I think it's like an 80s era Jackie Chan movie called The Armor of God. And it's like them trying to find this like holy armor in Europe. And they clearly didn't understand the tenets of Catholicism, but it was still a cool Kung Fu movie. Right. And so,
What you get for saying an insightful thing, JD.
I guess. Little known fact. She
Wish
was
that
the
would happen
reader
to
for
me.
my book. It was our first date. Anyways, but yeah, so I think it's interesting. Like, we get used to our lens, and you have to sort of consciously step outside and be like, I think Megan said it. It's like, what did these myths mean to the people in the moment, right?
Yeah.
And then alternately, like, how can our myths be
How can we-
misunderstood? Because like it has been said a couple times, the Christian myths of today are not the Christian myths of the medieval world, much less the ancient world.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see what those differences are.
Well,
You know,
absolutely.
There's
And
a point there, and I want to go back and connect
Go
what you
for it.
just said, JD, to something Marion was saying earlier. Because we're writers, right? Everybody here has confessed to being a writer. I think that's why we're on the panel. I think there was a craft point here about world building, and I think it's really easy to be sloppy in your world building and write a whole bunch of notes that are simply objective facts. And in this year, this happened, and this guy did that, and these guys did, or even worse, these guys were good and these guys were bad. But in the real world, we don't all believe in the same facts,
Right.
And we don't share. In fact, arguably, we don't have facts. What we have is mythologies. We have personal mythologies and cultural mythologies and political mythology. And so I actually really prefer, rather than, I'll do a certain amount of like writing objective things down. I much prefer to write in-world documents. Here are poems and riddles and stories and songs that the characters know that express some view of the facts that they believe. But here's another character's, riddle, witticism, whatever, that expresses or implies a different view. I think that's much truer to what Earth is like, to what living in the real world is.
I mean,
that's something as authors too, that we can give our characters permission to be wrong about things in their own world.
very true.
And again, I lean sci-fi in my in what I watch and read as well as what I write. But the Battlestar Galactica reboot from early this century did a super good job of exactly what you're talking about, David, because we saw their concept of their origin story and their religion over 2 or 3 seasons before they encountered some portion of the truth of it. And so we had an expectation built on their, I can't remember the term for it right now, but their in-universe, their sort of meta-narrative. And
the 12 Lords of Kobol, which I was actually going to get to, because we have mentioned no, it's a perfect segue. Because we have, we were talking, a lot in the past, and we're talking about present reinterpretations, but we're also seeing like things like Stargate, and Battlestar Galactica. Stargate using essentially a lot of heavy Egyptian mythology, and I know they went further into other mythologies when they did the TV show, and Battlestar Galactica, both of them essentially reinterpreting mythology both as the 12 Lords of Kobol from Battlestar Galactica. I mean, Star Trek in many ways is essentially has several reinterpretations of Greek gods at one point. We have Babylon 5. Babylon 5 having essentially involving angels in their world building, essentially as being the first ones. All of this. So we're seeing mythology in the past, mythology being reinterpreted in the future. How would you guys take this on? Because like you said, the 12 Lords of Kobol with Battlestar Galactica, which had a really kind of interesting take on the Greek and Roman myths, and going from there.
So
yeah, it was just alien enough to be familiar, right? Like, because they used the zodiac as the basic names for the worlds, right?
Yes.
And sorry, Rick, you were talking. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No worries. Babylon 5 is a awesome subject. But no, I mean to reinterpret a god into future times, I do this all the time. I definitely take a very Shadowrun aspect. I will take old myths and turn them into corporations and companies, and usually have like them be an embodiment or a representation of something like Ares arms or things like that. But then I will grind them and pound them into dust by the cultural setting of the world that is there, so that like if they ever had a pure purpose or a noble purpose, they are definitely covered in dirt and dragged through the mud all the way through the process. I beat my myths to the ground. So, and this goes because actually, contrary to what you were saying, Mr. Butler, down there I take the opposite approach. I actually have the truth in my books. Not all the characters know it, not that they're all there, but when you're trying to do a bit of conspiracy, you as the author knowing the true thread line and then distorting it through a vein of lines helps you keep your myths and your plots in check, especially if you have to like release conspiracy information bit by bit by bit through what somebody believes over here as a myth or a lie, so that you don't find yourself having like yourself tied up in your own loops down the line. But I do it through crowd thief. I reimagine somebody. I will take somebody and I will find a way that how would that god be imagined today? If I have the god of or one of the four horsemen, famine. If I was to reimagine him in modern day, like it would, he would 100% be somebody that was involved in like, model agencies, and like, trying to recruit models to, keep their diets up, or, I've done a lot of it with corporations though in my work, but that's because I did Shadowrun.
So, I mean, essentially, New Meat would be one of your one of Famine's,
Good omens. Good omens. Yes.
Yeah.
That's Good Omens. Yeah, but
that's good. There is one that is now like it's artificially grown. It's not real meat, but they're selling it as meat. I can't remember what it is.
Well, Good Omens had that artificial meat that had no calorie content whatsoever.
Yep. I mean, I love that stuff. But I mean, like they're the Lady of Bath, who would bathe in the blood of virgins, they would say, and she had like the legends of being like the first vampire and things like that.
Anna Bathroy, Lady of Bath was Chaucer.
Sorry.
Two very different women.
Two very different.
There you go. There's a new book set up.
We're going with the widow.
But taking her and reimagining, going the vampire bent of like, no, I was the good guy. I was doing medicine. But people are crazy. You can do a lot with reimagining, and I think that especially when they become your own characters, you are free to take them in a direction.
Excellent.
I think you're striking it like there's a novelty to it when you take a mythological concept or identity and make it firmly in a modern, like mundane context, like a corporation, right? Like there's been a recent run in Marvel, the Lady Thor series that they had that they're now turning into the movie, where the Roxxon Corporation started plundering the kingdoms of Asgard for natural resources. So they were just, it was a American mining operation moving into the Elf Kingdom. And there was something really novel about, it's like, oh, I get this. I see this on the news every day. Sans elves, right? So, and yeah, or to the Stargate thing, it's like, oh, we have this, this abstract concept of these Egyptian or eventually Asgardian gods. Oh, but they just turn out to be aliens. So now I can explain it, and they're sort of wrapped in this Air Force, pretty box for a storytelling perspective that makes them novel, I think, in an unexpected way. At least the first time they did it, or that you do it. Yeah.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about how Good Omens, where he had pestilence retire and pollution took over. And now with everything that's been going on this year, part of me is just like, so the story is now that pollution came out of, or pestilence came out of retirement and is trying to displace pollution for that fourth horseman seat or something. And
they're fighting for the crown.
They're fighting
tagged
for the crown
out
right now.
Yeah.
So I think novelty is attractive, but at the same time, one of the reasons to use mythological images and figures and stories is precisely the opposite. It's to find things that are enduring. There's a, you know, the classical Egyptian has two words for forever. The Egyptian text will say jet er nechech, which means modern translations, they used to translate this as forever and ever, but modern translations say enduringly and repeatingly. Enduringly is the kind of forever where things never go away. They're always here. And repeatingly is the kind of forever where things keep coming back and they never stop coming back. And I think mythology is the reason to use a mythology familiar to, or to build a mythology and make it familiar to your readers, is to tap into those modes of storytelling, tap into ideas and things that never go away, or that keep coming back to touch into the eternal.
And I agree, because even if you have a character or a god reimagined to become novel, even like Hades in freaking Hercules, his core tasks and his core meanings of what he still represented, even at the end of the tale, were still in line with what was happening. While they changed the personality, they made him more novel, they had him do song and dance, and he was definitely far more comedic. At the end of the day, he was still Hades. He was still the Lord of the Underworld trying to siege Olympus with the Titans, So, I mean, those tales that are there, even if you make them more accessible to people or you change them and reimagine them, I still think that you always inherently, if you're drawing upon those characters, are going to pay tribute to the part that makes them eternal.
Well, they were getting into Jungian archetypes, and that's a whole different ball of wax.
Oh boy. Well, we have time for one more question, and we're gonna have to do this one quick.
Not Jungian.
And
That'd be good.
oh boy, Jungian. No.
We even talked about author mythology. We all have. We
Well-
were talking about archetypes, and we all work off of a set of archetypes when we write our books that we
That's
all share.
absolutely true. We have room for one more question. This panel could go on forever. It would be enduring and repeating.
This is what we're missing out by not having bar time at the con.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
I am missing real conventions. In fact, I undercooked myself a hot dog today and then charged myself $50 for it.
And you had only ketchup available.
Just for novelty. But in all
Put it on a paper plate.
But in all seriousness, one thing that Rick actually mentioned was mythologies in terms of reinterpretation, but also that mythologies are still continuing enduring, because we do still have mythologies out there. For instance, Slender Man. We have myths to this day of things like the Bavarian Illuminati or the Gnomes of Zurich or whichever group is out there, lizard men, all of these, and actually you had mentioned internet mythology at one point, I believe.
Yep.
That, Slender Man, I believe, was an internet myth that just kind of emerged.
He was a creepypasta.
It was a creepypasta. Okay. And, these are things that are now continuing. And how could you interpret these, and how will we interpret these in stories going forward?
Oh, well, I mean, I naturally use them. I mean, they are the urban myths and legends that are born out of there, because the truth is that in my underlying truth of my world is that human belief they are God. So things that they imagine and whatnot can and tendency of a way to manifest, right? So thus, as people get access to magic back, they can bring things into the world that they're aware of. So things like Siren Head, which is a gloriously terrifying creature, filled with those air signs. If you're not familiar with Siren Head, go check out the artwork and the myth around this thing. It's goosebumpy. But taking modern urban myths are really, really cool if you want to ground your reader, I think, in something that they're familiar with, because you can go to Alabama with the Hugging Mollies. You can go to, obviously the Jersey Devil. You can go to Chicago, like Rosemary Cemeteries and things like that. And you can have legends that are localized urban legends that help bring your setting to life. And I think that on a smaller scale, those little myths help make a setting and magic pop, and have a little bit more oomph to them in a story.
Interesting. Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can add real quick, I think there's a really interesting take on this, because if you do like a Lovecraftian sort of like Mouth of Madness thing, and it sounds like you might be doing something similar, or Terry Pratchett and Small Gods, they have this, or even in the American Gods series, they have this concept that like the amount that people believe in something renders that thing true or real, right? So that's why you have like so many Jesuses in American Gods, right? Because there's so many different ways to believe in them, that each one of them's true. But to take like what you're talking about, stuff that's like mythological context, like the Mothman or the Slender Man or something like that, I think that sort of follows that sort of straightforward model. But I think you can do it with anything. Like, so we have the myth of how the U.S. was created. A lot of countries have their myths, or you arguably have, and I'm not trying to get into a political situation here, but like you've got like QAnon could almost be described as a myth system, and it's like the degree to which people believe it does sort of make it true, especially the less it's dependent upon a physical manifestation of a Mothman flying around Pennsylvania or whatever. So, so the idea of like the modern myth, I mean, I think it's something that's very real, that we can totally take advantage of as authors.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we are out of time, so I am going to give each of you guys just one very quick blurb to tell us where we can get all of your awesome books and where we can go. And we will start with Mr. Butler.
So unfortunately, Dave Butler is an exceedingly common name. There are multiple authors with my name, in fact, and all variants of it. So the easiest way to make sure you're actually looking at my stuff is to go to my website, which is davidjohnbutler.com, David, John, davidjohnbutler.com.
Excellent. And Mr. Hines.
So you can find my book series, The Seventh Age Dawn, up on Amazon with the Prince of Cats, and the redopera.com is the, crazy tales of warlocks, metal, and music. So
excellent. Mr. Jordan.
So like David, my name is exceedingly common. So my website is o-jd.com. There are links there to Calamity as well as its first chapter. There's also links to Shift, the story that was in the Granville Gazette, and a free short story set in the same world as Calamity. That's also based on the Thunderbird folk story. So, but yeah, check it out. It's all very cool. And if you like the books, please give a review. And if you don't, just keep it to yourself. Don't tell anybody.
Mr. Harmon.
Well, Marion is a very uncommon name. So if you go ahead and look me up on Amazon under Marion Harmon, you'll find my books, the Wearing the Cape series. My books are also available on the wearingthecape.com site. The PDFs of the game books are available on DriveThruRPG.
Excellent. And Miss Mackie.
You can find the Finder the Lucky Devil series on Amazon. It's also through especbooks.com. I'm also a contributing writer to Legend Lore through Onyx Path, which is coming out here in the turn of the year, which I believe you go to Onyx Path to find that. So, yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for attending Mythology and Writing. And just thank all of our panelists. Thank you guys for coming on out here and doing this for us.